my honor to introduce Jamie Walton. I met Jamie at the first day of my conference. We unknowingly got on the same train going back to the West Coast. Jamie is a civil engineer from New Zealand. He worked on a major project, a 7-mile water tunnel to a mountain in New Zealand. And subsequent to the first conference, we worked closely with Stephen doing intensive and meticulous research. He spent 2 years in Dennis Kucinich's office, and we owe him an incalculable debt in getting the American Monetary Act translated into legislation and introduced as the Need Act. And he will be talking on the seamless, instant conversion of our monetary system into the Need Act. So please welcome Jamie Walton.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, this is what's required, I think, to get monetary reform, is to make it simple and easy. And the Need Act really is simple and easy. And we're going to be having some sessions, after this presentation, toward the end of the day, to go through any bits of it. We're going to review it, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. So if there's anything that needs to be gone over again, we can do that. So again, it's the beauty of the Need Act is that it uses what we've already got. Nothing new has to be invented. Everything is there, all the infrastructure that the banks use, their messaging system, their wiring system, their computer platforms, that's all there, and that can be used straight away. It's what's being used now, and would be no different. So there's no overhaul or anything like that has to be done to the physical system or even to the institutional system. And we've already got what the Constitution says. That's what it says. So we don't need we don't need to change the Constitution at all, because that would be a lot of work and effort. But the Constitution already has got it right. And the Treasury they know that they have that power, and they use it. Every time we get these, that's pure seigniorage. And I knew that this must be written down somewhere in some accounting manual, and so I searched the internet for many weeks and months, and I finally found it. And I got a tingle up my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck went up, and I thought, yes, this is it. Finally, here's official recognition of sovereign money. And that's what it says. And I'll let you read that. Well, if you can hear me still, does this pointer work, Stephen? Does the pointer work?
You can see it today.
What is it?
Pointed at is it on?
I don't know. Anyway, so seigniorage is the face value of newly minted coins. Okay.
So hit the error button. Error.
Oh no, I want the pointer, like the red dot.
Oh, here's the pointer.
Ah.
That pointer, I see what you mean.
Oh wow.
Good sign.
Okay. Well, the main thing to look at there is that it is results from the sovereign power of the government to directly create money. And although not an inflow of resources from the public, it's not a tax, it does increase the government's net position. And that means it increases the government's assets without increasing the government's liabilities. So net position is another name for net assets or equity. And that's what's left over after liabilities are deducted from assets. But it has the same effect as though there had been an inflow of resources. And because it's not demanded or earned or donated, it's what they call in the Treasury's books an other financing source rather than revenue. And it's recognised as another financing source when coins are delivered to the Fed and basically monetised by being written up in the electronic computer as deposits. So again, to summarise the main points, it increases the net position, and that's the source there. And what that means is that money is created as a net asset or equity, not debt. Okay, so when you hear people say, "Oh, all money is debt," just show them a coin and say that isn't. And I've heard comments saying, "Oh, well, equity is on the liability side of a balance sheet." Well, that's one way of presenting a balance sheet, but what equity is the net assets or the net worth after you take away liabilities from assets. So it's an asset, it's not a liability. So this is what it looks like on a balance sheet, and this is what happens when seigniorage happens. It increases the assets, which is the cash balance at the Treasury, and it increases the net position, which is the equity. The way all other money is created is increasing the assets and the liabilities, and that's why we call it a debt-based system. But this way of creating money, the balance sheet still balances, it's just in another part, it's just balancing in a different part. It's just balancing different parts of the balance sheet. It's really, really simple, and it's been being done that way since the Mint was founded in 1792, so it's not, like I said, that doesn't need to be invented. Nothing needs to be invented there. And so Michael Kumhoff was very pleased when I found out about this. I sent it to him as part of correspondence I'd been having with him, and he really picked up on it. He was really excited about it like I was, and so he put it into his Chicago Plan Revisited paper, which swept the economic world by storm. And this is the way that he describes it, because equity basically means it's a share, it's a right. It's a right to a share in the commonwealth of the society, of the nation. So, since we've been having these conferences in 2005, this is what we've missed out on in terms of the amount of money that's been created. We've missed out on about $7 trillion worth of potential money that could have been spent on improving our infrastructure, our education, healthcare, all these things that are in the NEED Act. That's how much money has been created by the banking system. You can see there's Treasury currency at the bottom, but in green, but it's so small that it doesn't even appear above the line, the x-axis of the graph, because it's such a tiny amount. That's these coins. They don't even register on that graph because all the other numbers are so huge. So you've got checkable deposits and time savings there, and that's from the Fed's flow of funds accounts. And so when you break it down for each year, you see on average there's been about $700 billion created each year by the banking system. But you can see it's very erratic. Some years there's been nearly 900 billion, in other years there's been about 300 billion. So there's been a 60% drop. And so it's not hard to see why we had the Great Recession when you go from 900 billion being created to 300 billion created just in the space of a year. So the three key elements of the Need Act: put the Fed in the Treasury, like where the Bureau of Engraving and Printing already is, that makes the currency, where the US Mint already is, which makes the coins. So you just put the agency that makes the electronic money under the same roof, and you create a separate monetary authority to handle the policy functions that the Fed currently exercises, and you make that independent from the Treasury. The vital thing is to stop banks creating money, and we've got a simple way in the Need Act to do that. And it's the same as what James Robertson and Joseph Huber worked out in their book Creating New Money. And that's so it's basically they worked out the same way as well. And then you have to, like Stephen's mentioned, has been mentioned in the past, if you just did those two things and no new money was entering the system, there wouldn't be enough money, that you wouldn't be able to pay off debts and things. So you need to add new money to the system as the economy requires it. So the three key words that really help to understand the Need Act and what it does is equity, which we've already covered; bailment, which is a legal term, but it basically means you've got some property, but you hand over possession of that property to somebody else, but you don't hand over the ownership of that property. It's like if you put furniture in a self-storage shed, that furniture still belongs to you. The self-storage shed operator is just looking after it for you. And that's what we think, that's what we're taught is what banks do with our money. Now, we've all been taught that from elementary school, but they don't do that. So what the Need Act does is actually make that happen by putting our money, our deposits, our electronic money into safekeeping accounts rather than being liabilities of banks. I'll get into that. And the other key word is fiduciary, and that means that you're entrusting someone, an agent, which in this case would be a bank, to look after your money for you or to invest it for you if you want to put it into a savings or investment type account. And so what Dr. Kumhoff, the conclusion he came to was that this would not cause inflation, because if you're increasing the money at the same time as you're increasing the stuff of value that the money is used for, then they balance out and you don't have inflation. And so this is the genius part that I explained to that professor in Europe, and in words, and this is it in graphical form. This is what the process is. So at the moment, the deposits, most of our money in our bank accounts is treated as a liability of the bank. So basically, it's really just their promise to pay us money, which means their promise to exchange our deposits for cash on demand. But of course, as long as nobody else, or as long as everybody else doesn't want it at the same time, the same with the gold standard, it wasn't the gold to be able to do what the amount of deposits that they had, because they were creating extra deposits. So here we go, we just take that off there, put it under here. That becomes a safekeeping account, or what's called a custodial account, or a trust account. And banks already do have these. There's a part of a call report, which is what all the banks report to the regulators, and where is it? I don't know if you can see, but there's deposits there. There's non-interest bearing deposits and interest bearing deposits that are in a fiduciary account at this bank. So the banks already know how to do it. You know, so anyone that says, oh, they can't do that, well, they're one of two things. They're either misinformed or they're not telling the truth. So because they're doing it already. So it's nothing unknown about this. There's no uncharted territory. And the same thing you see. Okay, if we just leave things like that, there'd be this big hole in the liabilities of the banks. They'd have these liabilities taken off them, and so that would boost their equity. It doesn't show it on the graph, but on the chart, but that would be a huge windfall to the banks. If you took the majority of their liabilities off their balance sheet, their net worth would increase by the same amount. So what we do is we replace that liability that they had, we replace it with another liability. Now that this is real money here, as it's paid back to extinguish these loans, instead of being destroyed as money is now when loans are repaid, it's now that it's real money and it's always held in accounts like this down here, it just gets passed through from these accounts through the bank's account to the treasury, and it goes into a revolving fund. So it keeps the money alive, and then it enables it to be recycled, to be used again, rather than being destroyed. At the moment, it's very wasteful. You're always having to create and destroy, create and destroy. And that's why I like to describe the present debt-based money system as an extractive system. It's like digging a whole lot of stuff out of the ground and putting it back in a landfill. It's like, you know, and that's an unsustainable system. Like, whereas with the Need Act, we're continuously recycling money and adding more to the flow of money as needed, but only as needed in balance with what's going on in the real economy. So here's the existing borrowers that have got their loans, and they make the repayments through. The principal, instead of being destroyed, goes to the revolving fund and then can be recycled out again, back into the real economy. And then the interest is what is kept by banks when loans are repaid, and that becomes part of the bank's income, and from there they pay their staff and they pay their suppliers, and they pay their electricity bills and all that, and probably big computer maintenance bills. So okay, and the same thing happens at the Fed. The Fed is the banker's bank, but it's got the same sort of account system. All of the reserves and all of the Federal Reserve notes are treated as liabilities of the Fed. So we do the same thing. We take the money out and put it down there, and then we replace the Federal Reserve notes with US currency, as you know, over a period, and the reserves now they're not reserves, because when you're using real money, you don't need reserves. The money is the money. So again, there's this gap here, but because the shares have been bought by the Treasury, it's not owned by the banks anymore, the 12 Federal Reserve banks. It's owned by the Treasury. The whole system is owned by the Treasury now, instead of just being the board that's owned by the US government. The whole Fed system is an agency of the US government and becomes a bureau under the Treasury. And so they don't really need any stock, and they've got surplus assets as well, because the banks only are required to pay in half of the stock that they're supposed to buy, and they keep the other half as surplus. And the Fed has built up a profit to reflect that surplus, to make so that its net worth is adequate, what they think is adequate. So the assets that balance all of the reserves and currency notes, which is what's called the system open market account, and that's what open market operations is all about. That's where all the stuff that the Fed buys, that's where it goes, into the system open market account. So that's no longer required, because you don't need these treasuries to back the currency and the reserves. So that was at 4.2 trillion just before last conference. It's actually gone back to that same level now. It did go up a little bit higher, but now the Fed is starting to unwind. When its assets are maturing, they're not replacing them. So it's actually the same now. So it's mainly treasuries. There is some other stuff there. Now, because that's no longer required, it can be the reverse of open market operations can take place, which the Fed does do as well sometimes, with what's called repurchase or reverse repurchase agreements. So they can be sold back into the open market, and that the proceeds from that can provide the tax-free citizens dividend that's in the NEED Act, which 10,000 per person would be 3.2 trillion, and that's enough for people to pay off consumer debt, which is about 3.2 trillion as well. So that's, their high interest credit cards that are costing people 19-20%. They can pay that off. And it also does an instant drop in inequality. If someone's on 50,000, others on 10,000, that's 5 to 1. They both get 10,000. It goes to 60,000 and 20,000. It's 3 to 1. So you've reduced inequality in that example from 5 to 1 to 3 to 1 instantly. And of course, this also gives people who are on lower incomes more bargaining power to get higher wages, because they've just got what they were getting before, and they were, maybe surviving on that. So they're going to say to their boss, "Look, you better give me a better pay rise, or I'm just going to walk." And it can also, what's left over can also pay off the student debt. So we've got the system open market account assets and other Fed surplus assets which are no longer required, and that can be used to pay off to provide a citizen's dividend and a student's dividend, if you like, to pay off debts. And then that money would be used to pay debts, and it would end up being paid back through from the banks back to the revolving fund to be able to be used again. This money can keep circulating, being used again and again to clear debts. So that's what the reformed Fed, might still make loans to banks at some times, and it might even take deposits from banks at other times if banks have got spare cash the Fed already operates what's called a term deposit facility, and there may be a good reason to carry that on. And the excess assets have been sold. So how will banks make payments with the NEED Act? Well, actually exactly the same way that they do now. Particularly, I mean, for customers at the same bank, it make no difference at all. This is what would have used to have happened here in the liabilities. Now it just happens here in the money, between money accounts, from one customer to another. Between banks, same process, except that there's no longer a need to settle net imbalances between banks by settling reserves. Because it's all money. The money is the settlement asset, not the reserves. And banks already operate what they call real-time gross settlement. So they basically already do this now. And as I mentioned, all of the wiring system and computer platform that banks use, because my cousin works for a large US bank in their IT department, he told me that it's a completely different format. They got nothing to do with mortgages, and he didn't even know about reserves. They use a completely separate format, completely separate wiring, communication system, messaging system. So it's already set up to do this right now, because that's what happens. And then in the back office now, they settle net imbalances with reserves between the banks, but that's a separate operation. So the main operation of making payments between banks is already set up to work with the NEED Act. That's already what's done. And so how banks make loans? Well, the way that, again, we're taught from elementary school that they make loans now. They take deposits from savers and investors, go into the bank's pool of funds, and then the banks lend them out to borrowers. Isn't that, I mean, that's what, as Joe Bongiovanni said, that's what 90% of bankers think happens now. That's what 95% of economists think happens now. And that's what 99% of people think happens now. Well, and Congress. Yeah, so it's really not radical at all if it's what everyone thinks happens now. Okay, and so, as I said, the money that is recycled out through the revolving fund can be used to pay off a whole series of debts, and then back the other way. So that's see, all of these types of financial intermediaries, they have to do this. They're not allowed to create deposits. You know, you've got insurance companies, mutual funds, real estate investment trusts. You got and finance companies, all sorts of other financial institutions don't have the privilege of creating money, so the banks will be competing on a level playing field with them. And how will banks make loans? On the balance sheet, money will be taken from one customer, it'll be lent to the bank, so there'll be a liability of the bank to that customer, and then the bank will lend it to another customer, and that loan will be an asset of the bank like it is now, and the other customer will get the money marked up in their account. Oh, sorry. And the same between banks. Just the same. That one bank can loan money to another bank. Banks lend money between each other all the time now. And so if one bank doesn't have enough customers that have got spare funds, they can borrow the funds from other banks, and that's what's called the interbank market, and that, you know, or the federal funds market. So that there's no reason that will still carry on. And so where would banks get this money? Well, you see, most of this money at the moment is in time and savings deposits, which is really dead money. It's just tied up on banks' balance sheets as liabilities. It's not being spent, although you can access it and spend it if you want. So when the NEED Act, a month before the NEED Act is going to be enacted, the banks will contact their customers and say, how much money do you want to have in your checking account? How much money do you want to have in a savings or investment type account? And do you want any cash? And so people will feed back, and probably the default position will be, if they don't respond, that they'll put it all into a checking account. But most people will realise, I don't need all this money in my checking account. I can save and invest some. So there's this huge, there's this pool of money which is basically going to waste at the moment, which will be available for banks to actually lend out and do what everyone thinks they do now. And if, for whatever reason, that's not enough, banks can borrow from the revolving fund administered by the Fed. So like open market operations, but in the other direction. Instead of the government selling securities to the banks and the banks creating money and lending it to the government, it'll be the other way around. It'll be the banks issuing their bonds and their bills to the Fed, and the Fed will be recycling the money, relending the money back to them, And that's why, like Mark Pash said yesterday, that bank bonds and bank bills will probably become like a replacement for treasuries. And like I mentioned, they already are to a certain extent, particularly very high-rated German bonds. They're allowed to be used for capital adequacy requirements and foreign exchange. They get counted as foreign exchange for even countries' foreign exchange reserves. So again, there's three key elements. And so now the Treasury has this extra source of revenue. I mean, they have it now, but at the moment the seigniorage on the coins just gets used to pay down some of the interest on the national debt, so it doesn't really get used for anything useful. But now we're capturing all of the seigniorage from the money creation. We can use that to do something useful and not be so reliant on taxing and borrowing. And so seigniorage can be dispersed as a permanent addition to the money supply, but it can be taxed back later if required. And then for fine tuning, there'll be lending from the revolving fund, to moderate any ups and downs and fluctuations through, from season to season. So the Treasury has a lot of levers that it can use to balance its inflows and outflows of money, and so that gives them a lot of latitude to be able to balance payments in and payments out, and keep the money supply in a stable position. And the Treasury already operates hundreds of different programs for spending and lending money, and there's lots of distribution channels that can be used and utilised. So again, the three key elements. And the name of the NEED Act, the National Emergency Employment Defence Act, is to get the country to full employment, and that maybe sounds like an impossible sort of task, but in New Zealand in the 1960s and even into the early 1970s, there was full employment. There was genuine full employment. The amount of people on unemployment benefit, was literally a handful, 10 or 12 people at one point, and the Prime Minister knew the name of every person that was unemployed. And so it was what was called a worker's paradise, because if you didn't like your job, you could walk down the road and get another one, the same day, the same afternoon. And that's what it was like. Well, it wasn't like that when I left school, because we'd been neoliberalised by then, but when we were running the country for our own people, that's what it was like, with good practical policies that actually worked. So again, it's not something that can't be done, because it has been done. And it can be done, and this is partly the way it was done in New Zealand, was, building infrastructure, building up the nation, basically, educating the nation, all these things. So these provisions are in Title V of the Need Act. The first one is infrastructure, distributed on an equitable per capita basis. So there's no boondoggles or pork barrelling and all that sort of argument that you get into. Education, distribution to the states, interest-free lending to local government, the dividend, social security can be assured forever. So with the infrastructure, that's the American Society of Civil Engineers report card. That was the shortfall. And you see that that's nothing, that's hardly anything compared to the amount of money that's been being created by the banking system and not going into infrastructure. Okay? So it doesn't even get below the lowest point. It doesn't even get above the lowest point. So when I was in Congressman Kucinich's office, I had access to the best available information from the Congressional Research Service and the Congressional Budget Office and all of the federal agency reports that were done on employment generation. And I compiled it all together, and that's the rounded sum that came up to just for the infrastructure for federal spending. Then since then, the American Society of Civil Engineers say that it's now gone up because of the lack of investment in infrastructure. It's gone up from 2.2 billion to 3.6 billion that needs to be spent by 2020. And I don't think much of that money has been spent in the intervening 2 years, so it's probably still around that amount that needs to be spent in the next 5 years. So pro rata, I've got to go back and recalculate things, but pro rata, just on a simple pro rata basis, that'd be over 10 million jobs. Well, actually, when you calculate it, it's 11.8 million, but let's just say 10 million. And actually, possibly more because when looking at that data, the price of oil was going up. That meant that for every $1 billion, a lot of the price of building roads and stuff is taken up with the cost of oil. But now oil's coming down to about $30 a barrel. It was about $110 a barrel when the last study was done. So the number of jobs created was reducing. But now that the price of oil is going down, the amount of jobs created per billion spend could be going up again. So I think 10 million, I'll have to recalculate it, but I think 10 million is a reasonable estimate at the moment. And again, it's still nowhere near the amount of money that has been being created and mostly diverted off into asset speculation, not into building anything. You see, just pumping up asset prices, not building anything new, just buying existing assets. That doesn't even count as GDP. That's not something that increases GDP or wealth at all. Only financial wealth, only from asset price inflation. And that's not investment really. It's not creating anything new. Whereas with investing in new infrastructure and education and all those things, you are creating real values. So another thing is fully funding the education system from pre-K right through to 2- and 4-year public institutions like it used to be. I think Mark Pash, he mentioned yesterday, he went to UCLA and the tuition was free. So, again, it's not something that can't be done because it's been done before. And then, of course, you got the 25% distribution to the states that can add on to that. And if they distributed their spend roughly in line with the federal government's, that adds on even more investment for education. And so the figures I got for job creation through education is from this guy who was mentioned previously. And he wrote this report. It's very hard to find economics papers that deal with job creation or job generation. But this is one of the best that I could find that actually had comparable figures for different types of spending options. And one of the spending options is, well, it's very hard to read there, but there's education, and another is giving tax cuts, and the tax cuts don't generate as much jobs as investing in infrastructure or education or, retrofitting houses to be more energy efficient. They create much more jobs than just giving a tax cut, because, as we probably already know, the wealthy get most of the tax cuts, and they don't really do much, proportionately they don't do as much spending as other people in the economy that have to spend all their incomes and generate economic activity. So so here we go. Things like education creates much more than military spending or tax cuts. Healthcare creates more jobs as well, and that's also a possibility in the NEED Act. So when you look at that funding and you look at from the study, that's another 6.5 million jobs in education, to improve everyone's education. And that can be all sorts of education. It can be vocational education, it can be adult education as well, because a lot of those things are done at schools or at post-secondary institutions. So again, the grants to the states, if they're distributed in line to match the federal funding for infrastructure, for education, and healthcare, pensions, and unfunded mandates, it creates millions of jobs. And then what else does it do? Because the federal government usually doesn't need to borrow anymore, and because the state governments usually won't need to borrow anymore, and because the state and local governments have access to interest-free lending, they're not going to need to borrow at interest. So their interest on their budgets, the interest item, is not going to be there. So what they can do, they can provide more services, or they can provide tax cuts. And so even though tax cuts aren't as good at generating employment as direct investment in education and stuff, they'd still be very welcome for people that are cash strapped, and that means that there's more disposable income in their pockets to go and spend in small businesses, like Nick was talking about, like Mark Pash was talking about. What businesses want is people with money in their pockets to spend. They don't want people that are cash strapped. So you can reduce, this is based on 2012 figures that I did. I need to update them, but that's a lot of saving of not having that interest on the national debt or on the state debt and the government and the local government debt. And that money, what's spare, if it can be spent, but eventually it's going to end up with someone that wants to invest it. And this is the other provisions in the NEED Act. Can resolve underwater mortgages, which there are still a lot of. There's a way to do that that doesn't actually, I worked out a way to do that in Congressman Kucinich's office that doesn't actually require anyone to take a haircut, basically. And interest rate ceiling. So basically, compound interest is over. And so, the credit card interest would be reduced dramatically, and other interest rates would follow suit. Lower risk interest rates would follow suit below the higher risk debt. And another effect of not issuing treasuries is that other countries that have a surplus with America, they won't be able to buy treasuries. What they basically do, they accumulate these excess funds in the New York Fed, and they buy treasuries with them, and the Fed holds those treasuries in a custodial account for the other countries and other companies, And they won't be able to just do that. They'll have to either invest in American businesses or they'll have to buy American goods. That's all they can do with American dollars, pretty much, I think. So this is what the trade deficit is at the moment. And these 8 countries account for the total deficit. Actually, the US has a balance of trade surplus with the rest of the countries in the world. These 8 countries account for all of the budget deficit, the balance of trade deficit, which is 427 billion. So look at where it is. China, what's that? Manufacturing. Europe, possibly some high-tech manufacturing. Japan, again, high-tech manufacturing. Mexico, autos and things like that. South Korea, again, manufacturing. India, possibly a bit of manufacturing, maybe some raw materials. The same with Canada. So basically 95 to 98% of this is possibly manufacturing that has been lost from America, and there's been millions and millions of manufacturing jobs lost from America. And this investment could help boost high-tech manufacturing and start redressing the flow of jobs out of America and building up jobs and people wanting to buy high-tech stuff from America. So I had a table there that added all these things up, but I can't find it at the moment. But it was about 27 million and that was before the 2013 report. So that added another, say, 3 million. So it's over 30 million jobs there. And how will the financial markets fare? Well, all that money that was being invested in government debt will now be invested in the private sector. So there'll be a real boom for companies that want to expand. And they will be wanting to expand because people have got money in their pockets to buy stuff. So, and then it provides, you've got a stable monetary system. You don't have this pro-cyclical system like the fractional reserve system creates at the moment, where they create far too much money in an upswing and then not enough in the downswing, and it just exacerbates other cycles and things. And banks won't be able to manipulate markets. They won't be able to create money to buy shares, stocks and bonds themselves and bid up prices, and they'll be on the level playing field with all the other financial intermediaries like the company that Pat works at and the company that Mark Pash works at. They don't create money. So all these types of companies.
There's another one in that called a BDC, a Business Development Corporation.
Okay.
Small and medium businesses.
Right. Yeah, and the federal agency, the Small Business Administration, they make loans, and yes, all these things are already being done. And so what it does, it ends unemployment by creating full employment. It ends the debt crisis by paying off the national debt and reducing the need for the states and local governments to borrow, or if they do, it'd be at zero interest. So that ends their fiscal crisis, because that relieves the amount of outflows they've got relative to their revenue base, and they can even give some tax relief. And it ends the financial crisis by stabilising the monetary system, which is the thing that we've seen throughout this conference, and Steve Keen has talked about this morning, is the thing that destabilises the system. And the US dollar be a stable currency because it's not inflationary or deflationary. So that'll be attractive, for overseas investors as well. And why are we doing this? Well, because we want a beautiful, sustainable and enriching world for the kids. Thank you.
Want to take questions, Jamie?
Yeah.
Jamie will, Steve, will you carry the right or wrong.